And I'm going to switch my view here so that we can get going. Okay, welcome everybody near and far. I'm Megan Marshall. I'm the director of the Hugh C. Hyde Living Writers Series. And tonight we are celebrating National Poetry Month, and not just National Poetry Month, but the 25th anniversary of National Poetry Month. We have a stellar poet whose work is surely going to remind us why we should be celebrating poetry every month, right? Every month should be dedicated to a celebration of poetry. But before I welcome him to begin, I do want to take a chance to thank those who have helped to make this series and this event possible, and that includes all of our friends at Loft Library, Marco Tumlin, who is my trusty co-host, Danya Muka Hall, Laurel Bliss, and Jessica Zavala, and Rebecca Williamson, as well as the Department of English and Comparative Literature. And tonight I want to give a special shout out to Carla Cordero, and a very special thanks to Dr. Bill Nariccio, SDSU Press, and the Malas program for their support of this great event. And just a couple reminders, if you're joining us via Zoom, please keep yourself muted. There'll be a chance after the reading for you to unmute yourself and ask questions if you would like to. And just a reminder, as you may have heard, the event is being recorded. Lastly, please take a moment after the reading or whatever next couple days over the weekend when you have some free time, check out the Hugh C. Hyde Living Writers Series on YouTube. All of our events that are streaming, we record them and repost them there for your viewing pleasure. We also have a lot of great video responses from students enrolled in the Living Writers class. So, instead of binging that next series on Netflix, check us out on YouTube, a wealth of wonderful and entertaining videos for you. And then lastly, for more information on the Hugh C. Hyde Living Writers Series, you can check out SDSU's MFA community webpage. I'll put the link in the chat a little bit later if you'd like to know more about the last event that we have for this semester and then what's coming up in next semester. So without further ado, I'm excited and honored to introduce our featured poet for the evening. Michael Torres is a VONA Distinguished Alum and a CantoMundo Fellow. His first collection of poems, An Incomplete List of Names, was selected by Raquel Salas Rivera for the National Poetry Series, named one of NPR's best books of 2020, and was featured on the podcast Code Switch. Just a few of his additional awards and fellowships include the Loft Mentor Series Award, a Jerome Foundation Research and Travel Grant, and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. A former artist in residence at the Camargo Foundation in Cassis, France, he is a current McKnight Writing Fellow and a 2021-22 Jerome Hill Artist Fellow. His writing has been featured or is forthcoming in Best New Poets 2020, The New Yorker, Poetry, Plowshares, and the Georgia Review, among many other prestigious journals. Currently, he teaches in the MFA program at Minnesota State University, Mankato, and through the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop. What struck me most about Michael's aesthetic and his work was his unique ability to capture both broad mnemonic strokes, exploring expansive universal themes of identity, masculinity, and memory, while simultaneously evoking the personal and the intimate. Such moments distill sharply in great poems like Doing Donuts in an 87 Mustang 5.0 after my homie Chris gets broken up with, where I run my hand over pennies, Pepsi'd to the center console. And the poem Teaching at the Prison in December, with men who do not know, they remind me of nicknames and handshakes from back home. Of Michael's work and its expansive power, Jimmy Santiago Baca raves, with poems that drop like beads of acid on paper, sizzling away first impressions and assumptions, revealing in their burning wake the underlayer of truth, and how, if it after years still smarts and bleeds and blossoms in us. I love this book more than I have any other book in a long time, celebrating our duality, the multitudinous breadth and depth of our varied and bounteous humanity. That is an amazing review. So please join me in welcoming Michael Torres. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. And thanks to everyone who's here attending. I always realize or recognize that you could be doing anything else tonight, but you're here hanging out, listening to some poetry. So that's really appreciated. Thank you. Um, yeah, so I'm gonna read mostly from the book, and then I'll read a couple new poems. I've been using these like last couple events that I've been doing as a way to like get myself back into sort of that momentum of new work and trying to not figure out, but like explore the new project of poetry or whatever it might be. So I'll read a couple of those in a bit, but I'm going to start out with poems from the book. And the first one I'm going to read, um, so I grew up in Pomona, California, Southern California, and then I moved to Minnesota to do my MFA, and I've lived here ever since, teaching, and I have my whole life here now. And so this poem was written in the MFA when one of the first times I visited home again. And so okay, page numbers. Yeah, this will be page 72. Um, and so this poem was like when I first started realizing that um, that home was it meant something different all of a sudden because I wasn't living there anymore. And so this is sort of me thinking about that. So it's called My Hometown as a Man Riding a Bicycle with No Chain. His legs, a too quick clock, a kind of cruel that tells me any time away from home is too long. Pomona becomes a man asking if I want to buy his MP3 player. He raises headphones to my face. Listen, he says. No one believes him. But he doesn't say about what. It's how they say yes, but don't look. I nod. He talks about his daughter who works at AutoZone, who's the manager now, the jefe. But his son, who I'm certain I went to school with, who walked into fifth grade one morning with shaved eyebrows and sat down without saying a word, who never spoke to anyone ever again, he does not mention, not even once. Where have all my classmates gone? Where I grew up has nowhere to live, but he says he'll be all right, he'll be all right, he'll be all right, 'cause the lady from the next block over owes him for mowing her lawn. And have I seen a Bible around? No one's going to pick it up, he says, not unless it had $100 in it. Wouldn't that be something? He's nodding, he's balancing himself on the bike, he's trying to leave, but will I be here tomorrow? He might be around, my town's always around, so how about that MP3? I can keep it if I want. No, how about for 10 bucks? My town is presenting its callous palm. Now my town, relentless, pedaling like everything is all right, like everything is all right, like a Ferris wheel no one's going to ride. Look at it spin through the evening. Each basket scooping sunlight and shadow. The carnival worker we turn away from calls for us and keeps calling long after he knows we're gone. So, um, I have a series of poems in the book. Um, in a persona called the Pachuco's grandson. Like that's kind of how each of these poems begin and the title. And I started using persona as a way to, I feel like to have a speaker that was like braver or more willing than I myself was to like write certain experiences. And so all of the next like three poems kind of come from that Pachuco's grandson persona. So this next poem is on page 37, and it's called "The Pachuco's Grandson Considers Skipping School." I didn't want to be bad, but I wanted to be bad. Yesterday, someone threw a book at the sub's head. All I saw was a bird with paged wings. And today, when I walked into class baggy jeaned, he took roll but didn't call my name. That's how I knew I didn't have to answer no more. I became absence in my seat, asleep, became block letters for the name my homie bestowed. I dreamt chain links and angel wings, how to escape. At some point we were awake, yes, all the brown boys like me, and we carved our new names into desks in the shape of hearts. What a beautiful beating. We cut the tongues from our old shoes to stuff into new ones later so they'd pop like a bullfrog puffs when it's in danger. No one to recognize us. We were more mustached than our mothers could manage. Before fifth period, some left. Through a window, my homies clicked chins, what's up, for me to come through. Don't let the wind between the branches fool you, their eyes said. Every looking out also implies enclosure. Out there, where I could be anything, I placed a silver chain around my neck, and it fit like a slipped halo. So, um, the next one, um, sort of in the same vein of the Pacheco's grandsons, which is to say, I ended up writing a lot about middle school, and then at first I thought all that I had to talk about with identity, because a lot of the book um, is about masculine identity and Mexican American identity. I thought a lot of that was like rooted in like high school experiences, and then I kept going back to like middle school, and it's just like kind of surprised me, or I was taken aback at how like early those sort of things go on in one's life. So this next poem is on page 60. Suspended from school, the Pachuco's grandson watches Happy Days while his homie fulfills prophecy. All morning I searched for my grandfather in zoot suit pants like two pairs of parentheses in case he happens to walk into Arnold's. But after a few episodes, the whole gang bores me. I don't know anyone like Richie or the Fonz who isn't as hard as he thinks. It's that leather jacket everyone wants or fears. All my heroes are my homeboys who move through the impermanence of their day. Right now, Mr. Appel is calling one of my homies to the front to solve for X because he thinks it was that fool who yelled out, "Mr. Apple," from the back of class. My homie, who knows the answer is 7 and -7, will trace an apple on the board before leaving pre-algebra forever. My heroes are good at their getaways and not saying goodbye. My grandfather used to say it was all about balance, being Mexican at home and white out there. He invented tightrope walking and sold his secrets to the circus. Now, I read history books, but don't say anything. They called my grandfather Pancho. They called him Greaser. Our achievements listed on the page nobody wanted to print. Okay, maybe I don't know that grandfather. Just spun one into existence, a web I could rest along. I wanted to use my head like my hands and hold something. Right now, Richie and the gang are in trouble. Someone fucked up. It won't last. I've seen this one. Right now, no one is stopping my homie. I don't know if I would have. I must remember this. Fonzie laughs and everyone joins. I don't know why. They don't either. The credits roll. The outro plays. My homie jumps the fence by the track, by where the ice cream man always parks after school, and the chain links rattle after him. I'll actually take a quick break from the book and um, read one of two new poems. Let me see, which one do I want to read? I'll read one I have not read at all, and I was just working on like 30 minutes before this event. So in the book, there's three poems actually where I talk about um, my speaker's brother who's in prison, and sort of like grappling with that fact, basically, that someone has a relative or a family member in prison, and like the sort of loss with all that. So this is um, after the brother is released from prison, and yeah, and it's I'll just read it. It's called Obad, Desiring to be an Ars Poetica, with a release date inside it. My brother in the backyard sleeping, hours after he gets out. This image of him, there I am, beyond it, at a desk I've placed next to a window because of this life I've chosen. With my pen fixture like and a sheet of paper, let me start again. It's very early morning, and my brother sleeps on the cement in the backyard. I don't know why. I don't know what I think this poem can do for my soundless brother, but my pen on the page, where the image I've created of a brother alone with his sleep begins to draft also a ladder against the wall for my quiet brother to climb in the sweats he came home in once he wakes. Awake, brother. My mother asks what he's doing there, and there she is, my mother, at the kitchen window overlooking the backyard and the street beyond our house. Yellow plastic gloves hang over the faucet in front of her. They drip soap water right next to my lack of imagination. I've always placed my mother kitchen busy when all she wants to do is read a novel on the couch before going to bed. She has been made to search each situation for what's better, for what can be navigated. She dries her hands and calls to tell me my brother is home now. Finally, I haven't realized if this poem is about my own brother stirring towards chance or what my mother wishes for. One day, I decided to call everyone to the front yard and announce that I was going to become a poet. Everyone nodded, then hurried back inside. Everything was good for a long while. I grew strong, took out loans I intended to forget, piled up memories onto each page, and felt sufficient. But look now, there is the morning, miles out. It approaches my brother, my slim brother, who is about to blink, just like in a fable. My brother will wake up. He must. My mother can't find her glasses. She goes outside, offers my brother a basket of oranges she hopes he holds like a chalice. I write small clouds, and there they pass above him. Every star exits on a blue string. It's like cool to look up and seeing people snap. Thank you very much. um, um, so this will be the third and final of the Pacheco's grandson poems that I'll be reading. This one's on page 83. Um, I don't know why I don't read this one as often as the other two. I think because the other two Pacheco grandson are deal with like identity and masculinity, and this one deals with like love and masculinity. Maybe I don't know, but I think this one is I don't know. I like it too. I don't know. I mean, I don't not like any of the poems in the book. So yeah, page 83. The Pacheco's grandson considers the Silver Sun Pickups album Diana lent him when they last spoke 7 years ago. This morning, the sky stays hidden by the kind of gray you like, egg carton thick, sloth slow, jamming sun paths, heavy breaths of rain land one at a time. It should be late spring, but there are no leaves to catch what keeps falling. I am alone, of course, CD in my hand. I've been waiting for the sky to tell me what to do next. My life's not been hard, but I've spent it all without looking over my shoulder at the expanse of dust I made from what I carved away from the curb I called kingdom. God knows how to make a sign out of anything. A song played on the radio for the fifth time that day, petals plucked from flower heads. Yesterday, Danny told me you got married. He said Diana got married like that, and with the respect or pity men have for each other. He did not face me. I wanted him to think this was news as well. I didn't want to be lonesome. Nothing's news if you pay attention. The heavy sky rumbles, whatever it will be has been barreling its way here. I didn't answer Danny, didn't think I had to, but because silence gathered its storm between the kind of guys we grew to be, he said, "Why you all butthurt? Really, I was thinking of a boy I am not, a boy on a skateboard from days before, pushing pavement, gripping a bouquet of roses. Did he get there, to where he was going? I hope not, and I hope so. I wanted to hate that silly boy, but I couldn't. Instead, I told Danny, fool, shut the fuck up, and laughed. The sky has nothing to say this morning, and when the clouds decide to go, the sun will point at me. and ask if I will stay for more or pay what I owe. Of course, I break the CD I was always going to snap it gone. It doesn't play anymore. Hasn't for years. It's okay if you know this now. I used to keep it inside the glove box where I knew it was, even if I didn't want it to remind me of those years. It did. But here, watch me bend it. I can do without the sky's answers. Watch the light warp like a bouquet's plastic wrap struck by sun. See the way it fits into my fist. Let me make it less. As long as I turn away right after, as long as I don't for an hour pluck pieces from my palm, the way a child might toss daisy petals, might say something about love as each bit hits the ground. Okay. I'll give a two poem warning. I like when poets or readers give us like the how much poems we got left. So now I will go back to the other poem. For some reason I've been so not for some reason, I've been reading Victoria Chang's amazing collection called Obit. And that has, I don't know why, the for some reason is that the sort of prompt I gave myself, it was the title Portrait of My Father as a Painter. And then I've been writing like many of those, like that's just the title. I just keep writing that poem over and over, like different ways. And in part, because I haven't seen my folks in like over a year, as many people probably haven't seen people in a long time. And my parents are in, my dad's going to be 80 this year, and so he has like, he's having health issues too. So I'm just like, I don't know if I'm trying to write the conversations I wish I was having with him, but I'm writing just towards this idea of like not having seen him. um and so this one is one of those portraits, and this one's called Portrait of My Father as a Painter. And then it began to rain. So my father hired an actor. The new old man walked up with an umbrella he opened as he sat in front of the easel next to me. He let me know that he's been paid through the duration of the storm. In the pocket of his thick plaid vest, a pocket watch tethered by a gold chain. My father's never owned a watch, but I thought close enough. I scooted beside the stand and ducked under the umbrella so that we were close. I asked, "Who do you think you can be? Did your own father have trouble getting out of bed? Is the sunlight still a playground slide? It wasn't that confining, was it? I'm talking about childhood, but do you think I shouldn't? What else is there to look back on? The field and everything that didn't come through it? A graveyard is also a field, right? What do you think the dead think of having their own field, their own trees? With or without the rain, no father of mine, real or rented, would open his hand with answers. The old actor stopped painting, looked up at me and said, "The clouds have collapsed and I will move on." There was only 10 minutes left of his shift, so I said to my by the hour father, "I love you," by which I mean I confessed to visiting the pueblo in Mexico where my real father grew up. I asked his brother to show me where he learned everything he learned. In his Datsun pickup, my Theo drove me through town until we arrived under the mesquite tree. We got out and he pulled at a low branch, sucked from a shell, told me my father was spoiled. Always had nice shoes, he said. At the market later that week, when my Theo ran into a neighbor, he would point at me saying, "Él es el hijo de Juan." I only nodded, translating everything 2 minutes too late. Before I went home, we drank Coronas on the tailgate of his pickup that he parked in front of a field. I looked down, and all my fathers were gone. No clouds, no pocket watch gold, just me and my rained-on shoulders. Cool breeze and sunlight on my neck. On the canvas was an overgrown field of grass, and deep in that green painting, a bright rooster in its one glance. All right. So I will end with end on page 86. And This is one of 3 All-American Mexican poems. All of them have the same title, and they all, it was like a summer project and a failed chapbook, and then these 3 poems came out of it, which I'm really happy about, because they were poems that they were so unexpected to me, and that was like a fun thing to be surprised by oneself. All-American Mexican. And lastly, thank you all for being here. All-American Mexican. All I wanted was a Cadillac on chrome, real diamonds in my ears, and someone to call my name through a crowd. Instead, me and the homies drove to the mall in my hatchback, rocking dog tags with Tupac on them. We lived for his West Side fingers. We stopped at nothing but silver, a store where I sifted through glinting trays of jewels for princess cut earrings. No one asked if we needed help, but everyone stared a long time. No one called our names, so we took new ones, swallowed them whole, and they grew inside us. Inside the food court bathroom, our new names bloomed black from Magnum markers. Inside stalls, I practiced the R, the E, the M, the E, the K. Our names too real for us to contain. We left, and I was glad my hatchback bubbled up window tint distorted our faces. Everything is always up for interpretation. Yesterday, I ran an image search of the white boy from 10th grade who said I looked like a dog. I wanted to find him posing in a too wide tie for a job his face would tell me he hated. When I found nothing, I thought he might be dead, so I looked for a park to sit with my guilt, wondering if I could have saved him had we become friends instead, had I helped retrieve his stack of notes blown apart by the wind. I am mostly filled with fantasies where I'm the hero, a parade and a coupe de ville away from the key to the city the mayor presents on a red velvet pillow. Now, when I visit home, I want to cry, but the homies would notice. And it's not that they'd laugh and call me a little bitch. No, we are only as young and thuggish as America needs us to be. The problem is, my homies wouldn't recognize the puzzle my body has made of itself. Let me say it like this: I'm a stuffy June room, and the homie has only been taught to pry open whatever might test him. That's real. Once I was so real I became a cathedral at noon, not the bell itself, but the rope pulling sound from absence. I was only my heart glowing against the bones, holding me back. Everyone stood to watch. Someone yelled fight. Someone said I was scared, but I was so real. I burst into the wind like fuck the world. Nothing dissolves like I do. I came here to create a diversion, to splinter furniture for the fire. If I'm going to be real, I am who I've always been, a boy seeking an orbit to align with. One day, I'm gonna get poet tatted on my chest. Only instead of the O, I want a window through which you can see my childhood backyard, way before I became something like a souvenir. I might make my artist ink the tire swing. He says, the worst it'll hurt depends on where I want to plant the trees. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Let him hear you clapping. Great job. Wow.
So good.
So powerful. And I'm hoping that we can come back to that kind of the sequence of poems. It was really interesting to hear you say that the All-American Mexican was a failed chapbook, but then a few of the poems stuck for the collection. So I know that folks have questions, so I want to maybe give those precedent over all of the things that I want to talk about, right? So if you could please use the little hand raise function, or certainly you're welcome to throw a question into the chat for Michael, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So let me see. There's I saw. Okay. So I guess if we could start, I was wondering if maybe, Michael, you could talk a little bit, I mean, just kind of in relation to those poems, the act of putting together this collection, because I know you were talking about, some of them were written while you were in the MFA program. And so if maybe you could kind of walk us through just that process of putting together your first book.
Yeah. So I think all the poems I wrote during the MFA, and then even many for that first year outside the MFA, were basically part of, I would say, like the initial first like full draft of the book, where I thought that in part it was like my responsibility to write certain stories from back home based on um, like conversations I had with friends growing up, who like I have this one of my best friends, Miguel, who is in the book. When I at first for the first time I was telling him like I want to become a writer, like that's what I want to do. And I'd sent him like my first publication, and he called me on the phone, and when I told him that, he's like, you have to write a book about us so they know who we are. And like, we didn't discuss who the they was, but we knew it was just like anyone who didn't see our story, like anyone, because we didn't see our stories in school. And so I think a large part of writing the book was first trying to get that down in a sort of honest way, in a very real way, where if my friends, if they read the book, they would, I would hope that they could um, nod and be like, yes, this is true, this thing happened. And so that was like, in part, that was like the first like feeling of how the book should sort of, what it should do. And then I think the couple years, a few years after the MFA was when I started realizing like, not only am I writing about home, but I'm also like, me and my speaker are grappling with the fact that I'm not going back home like I thought I was. And so then there's this whole, then that's when those like all American Mexican poems come in, because then there's this huge attention to like code switching, and also like identity as, professor, but also identity as like the homie, but the homie who returns and has to leave and go back. And so those are like two parts that sort of like end up fusing together how the book came about. Just this like, it's in some ways I think of it like as a love letter to home, but in other ways I think of it as like also a breakup letter to home. And it's really, yeah, that's kind of that's like a simple way to put it though. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the explanation, and I think that's why, as I mentioned in your intro, what really drew me into the work is just your ability to kind of encapsulate both those universal themes, like like love, like identity, and but also kind of make them really intimate. I mean, to the speaker. So we can both kind of see ourselves, or readers can see themselves, but they can also see sort of this other kind of communities or experiences through the speaker's eyes. So what other questions do we have? Oh, yes, Rafael has a hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to ask your question.
Hey, Michael, thanks for sharing your poems with us. You had mentioned earlier, or at the beginning of the reading, that you weren't sure why you didn't write about middle school. And as someone who's writing about like also like the barrio and growing up with people who, like you mentioned, looking up to them, even though they were going down, I guess, like a destructive path. And middle school is like kind of where everything starts, because that's where you still have friends from like elementary school, and that's kind of where everyone's roads start diverging, and then you start forming those little cliques. So do you feel like you're gonna start exploring that space, that time, and how do you think you would balance that out, or how would you go about doing that?
Are you talking about like middle school and high school, or like middle school in particular?
I think you mentioned middle school, but if you haven't written about high school, then yeah, the same question applies.
I think so. Like, I have a couple different answers. I think I have been wanting to write like a young adult novel based on like high school experiences that are like a little different than what's in the book, but also um, deal with identities and the lack of like, how should I say this? The lack of like possibility. I think people give like brown men, brown boys, especially like who
Mm.
we can be. I think I've been thinking about that for like a young adult novel, but I think with the with the poems, um, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if I went back to writing about middle school and high school. I think it's just trying to write, because I've written some about high school and some about middle school, and I think I just if I go back to that, I would try to figure out like ask more questions and go deeper into those experiences. Because every time I like when you start writing about those experiences, you sort of jog your own memory, and then you remember something else that you previously hadn't like thought of or remembered, and kind of go after that. Um, so because there is like a lot of that I think you're right, and like I was sort of mentioning, like that moment in middle school is really where you really begin to shape an identity, because like it's like that move from elementary to middle school is like a marker of like, hey, we're grown-ups. In like your middle school mind, you're like older and more mature than you're like that kid self in sixth grade or fifth grade or whatever. And
Mhm.
so that is definitely like a really important time, that as a kid you don't want to be a kid anymore. You want to try to keep up with everybody who seems to be who's like getting older or growing up, even though it's like happening really fast. And so I think trying to slow that down, whether it's in a poem or prose, um, is could be really important to my writing or to your writing too.
Mm. Thank you.
Hmm.
Right. Thank you, Rafael. Great question. What other questions do we have for Michael? And remember, you can throw in the chat. Yes, well, let's start with Veronica, and then we'll go Sarah after that.
Hi, Michael. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your grandfather and sort of how maybe that era of Pachucos and Zoot Suits inspired you in your writing.
Yeah. So I will say that like a lot of that is memory, but okay, so I'll say two things. One is that like I know somewhere there is a picture of my grandfather in like a zoot suit, but I also know he was in World War II. So there's this weird like contradiction there, or weird like tension there. Um, and then the other thing I'll say is that like the idea of the Pachuco's grandson came from reading um, Octavio Paz's Labyrinth of Solitude. And in particular, I think it's the first essay in that essay collection called The Pachuco and Other Extremes. And I read about the Pachuco as this sort of like, um, this resistant sort of character, a character who's resistant to being, American or Mexican. And so like creating his own sort of identity. And I felt like when I was had first, and I read that when I first moved to Minnesota, like seeking some sort of identity. And so I read that in Minnesota, and I like really related to that. So I was like, well, what would it look like, you know, if there was a character or persona who was the Pachuco's grandson? So I kind of skip in that persona, you kind of skip over the father, because you want like the Pachuco or the grandson wants to identify with this like um rebellious, but not like rebellious for the sake of being troublemaking, but rebellious for the sake of feeling like safe. Because if someone is like rebellious and seen as wild, then they're dangerous and people might back off. And I liked that idea of um that sort of persona and that sort of character, um taking on those sort of qualities. And that was a way that, like I said, that persona could be braver than like Michael Torres the writer was, and kind of find ways to talk about things that were difficult, um half of which was like masculine identity, the other half was like love and masculine identity, which was like really interesting to me at that point. And so the Pachuco was just like this really fascinating character for me, and I just wanted to like see what I could do with that in a poem form. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that in so long. Thank you.
Great question, Veronica. And I love what you said, Michael, about, using that persona to have a speaker that's braver, than you are, because I feel like already maybe when we're writing poetry, there's this sense of this, being a mask, right? And that we can lie in our poems. But I think through the use of persona, we almost have sort of another layer of padding there through which we can explore those kind of difficult things that we're grappling with. So that was really interesting when you said that earlier. And those were some of the poems that we discussed at length in the class that students really resonated with.
That's cool.
Okay, sorry, Sarah has a question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for taking my question. So you were saying, it's funny that you brought up the idea of writing for a young adult or like, youth audiences, because my question that I was kind of ruminating on was the idea that you have such a good sense of getting into the mindset of what it's like to be that age, whether you're writing from a middle school perspective, or what it was like to be in that moment, as a 12-year-old, 11-year-old, or even in high school. And I'm just wondering how much you are so great at capturing that time, but at the same time, you're definitely capturing your mind as an adult and your persona as a poet. And I'm just wondering how much you identified as a poet or having that mindset at all when you were those ages. And I'm really thinking about the concept of you writing a novel or writing fiction for that age group and how those personas might come together, like you as that age, thinking of other kids who could be reading at that age. I taught high school literature for many years, so I'm thinking of the kids that I taught and how I identified with like the kids who were poets. I could see that in them, and I think about if you were in my class, like would I have seen that in you? So I guess that's my question: is like, how do you see all that coming together, and like, did you identify with that poet voice when you were that age?
Wow, that's a really fascinating question that I was thinking about this last night, working on this like Q&A interview over email, but um I part of this, so I'll say like I don't know if I always like thought of myself as like, or like thought that there was like a poet in me, I guess. I mean, not that you're necessarily saying that specifically, um but I've had the great fortune of always being allowed to um express myself like creatively. Like I always got to do that at home. I was encouraged by family to do that. um Even when I did graffiti, I like when I got caught for it and in trouble for it, like my mom was like disappointed, but she didn't make she didn't make it seem like it was a really um bad artistic decision, I guess. And so like I've always, so that coupled with the fact that like I think um I'd always been like a sensitive kid. And so like certain moments, experiences that some I've written about, some I haven't, like struck me as um like they just struck me when I was a kid, and I was able to like first for reasons I couldn't understand until I got, until I became a writer, until I started like really mining and digging up those memories. Like I didn't know why I remembered them. Like I didn't know why that they stuck with me until I started writing, and it made a lot more sense that like um things that I was sensitive about and had sort of, captured that image in my mind when I was younger made more sense as I started writing about them. And they're usually moments of like um, where there's some sort of tension and there's something like at stake, even at such a young age. But like I say that as if like when we're young, the things that are important to us aren't actually like a big deal, because they are really big deals, because we're only like at the time 12 or 13 or 14, and they're huge deals to us, and so like I just try to like I try to capture that now using that sort of that. And this is like more of a creative nonfiction idea in my mind, is that there's the dual perspective. There's the me at 34 who's looking back down on this kid on a skateboard at 12 years old, and like he's seeing that all he's going through simultaneously, like this kid is going through these things, and like I'm trying to like reflect and interpret those things as the older writer self to see that. That's and that dual perspective is also why the idea of a young adult novel is also like really almost kind of frightening, because then I would have to be more in this 12 or 13 or 14-year-old perspective, and I like really want to do that voice justice. But I mean, I don't know. I think it'd be fun because I go back to those middle school, high school moments. I did so much in the book because that's such an important time. And often I think when we're adults in an adult sort of world where we have to work and pay bills, we think back, oh, like that was just some silly kid stuff that I did, but it was actually like those things were really important. They had like really big impacts on who we were, and we just don't like to think about it often. But like I always remember those moments, and I thought they were so. I didn't know why I remember them, but I knew later, oh, they were really important actually, that these things were remembered.
Thank you. That was a great question, Sarah. And I agree that, I mean, you really do so well with negotiating that voice in the collection. And I think, I mean, I would love to see like a YA verse novel. I feel like, I mean, the voice is almost already there, just to kind of transfer it to like a different mode of writing. I think that would be amazing.
And now I'm like recorded that I said that I might do that, so now I like have to do it.
Yeah, you've heard it, everybody. We're live on Facebook too. You know, it's going to happen now, Michael. It has to happen. So, well, in kind of regards to that, you know, we talked a lot in my class about the different kind of selves and the sort of like fragmented identities that we see in the collection. You know, sort of like the Remick self, the poet self, you know, the teacher self. And so Becky has a great question in the chat. She says, your poems discuss code switching and identity. Do you feel like code switching is an act of survival for people of color in America? And if people code switch, are they ever able to be their authentic selves or have an authentic identity?
Yeah, this is such a good question. So let me look over and see how I want to attack this question. So and my answer might change in like a month or something, based on like what I'm working on creative nonfiction, thinking about code switching, but I'm thinking about not just code switching like in the way one talks, but like physical code switching, like how one moves. And that's so interesting to me. And I think that code switching is more than just survival. I think one can thrive off of code switching. And like to me, like those All-American Mexican poems, that came from the idea that like code switching wasn't just to like survive or make it like, you know, sort of be camouflage. Like that was part of it, but then there was also like the speaker code switches when he really wants to benefit from a situation too, when he can benefit from a situation. So it was more than just survival. And I've also started thinking, unless this is what the part where I'm most like, maybe I'll change my answer in a month, but I think all of the code switching selves are, and all of them are authentic selves. I want to really believe that, because or else like part of it is like mental health reasons, like thinking like, oh man, am I being a fake self or something, you know, like just trying to like have that conversation with myself or with oneself to say like we have to adjust to the situation. I mean, I think even for people like people who are not of color, like white people, like I think like you have different groups. You talk to your close friends differently than you might talk to your colleagues or your coworkers or your family members, or family members you like and family members you don't like. Like you speak differently. And I think in some ways like I think they are authentic selves, all of them. I don't think that we should be like, oh, this is the real me, this is the fake me. They're all like different. We're like we're like multifaceted, and I don't want to hold myself to just be like, oh, there's a fake me. then there's a real me when I'm home. And maybe there's a more comfortable me when I'm home in like Pomona, California with my homie, like sitting passenger in his like, in his Cutlass. Like maybe that's a more comfortable me. Like even saying that right now, I'm like shrugging my shoulders in a certain way that feels weird in Minnesota to do. But that's still like, that's all like really real, I think. And really, I think all those selves are authentic. It's really, I think, unhealthy to feel that to put that pressure on oneself to say otherwise.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that answer and great question as well. I've just been thinking, I mean, we were talking before the reading began about this return to like in-person classes. I've just been thinking too, like, do I have, am I code switching virtually? Is there like a virtual me and now I'm going to have to return to like an in-person me? And what is that negotiation going to look like? I mean, that's on a much smaller scale. But it kind of gets me thinking about the different roles that we play, the different selves that we are. And I feel like I have a virtual version of myself now.
For the first few weeks of Zoom classes, I realized how much of a performer I am, and I was trying to joke with my students, but everybody was either on video or not on video, and no one was laughing. And I was like, "Oh, I'm not funny," or like, "This isn't in person." And so what's happened now in my class is that like I'm basically like some sort of like I do like a live stream basically, and everybody types in the chat and no one's looking at me or talking to me in like audio, and I'm basically like reading their reactions and reading their questions, and I'm like someone else now. I'm like being a different, like I've had to like I've grown a different sort of teaching limb, and it's so weird, but I'm like adjusting to that too, and but missing the performative aspect because I loved the space of the classroom and getting to walk around, and I don't do that here now.
Yes, I mean, I love how you described it as like another arm, like you've grown another teaching arm. Because I feel the same way. And I imagine too, students feel like we've grown a whole like learning arm. And it's difficult with the 15-second delay, getting that sort of social response. So I think it does require, another fragment of ourselves, perhaps. What other questions do we have? What else for Michael? Maybe while we're waiting for another to chime in, as was said earlier in the chat, your titles are just fire. And I feel like, and I've discussed with students before, that coming up with good titles is so difficult, or can be so difficult. So can you please tell us how we can take away some of that magic from you? How can we be like you in that sense? What do you do?
I would say not to, like, I always have like tentative titles, and then I end up changing them towards the end based on context, so that it provides enough context and sort of is starting the poem and is in conversation with the rest of the poem, but also that is the beginning of the poem, and so trying to find a way where the reader is interested. Like the Doing Donuts poem is so long and weird, and so I think that's a way to kind of grab the reader's attention, but just making sure that the poem, like, sort of, that the title works for the rest of the poem too, and it doesn't like mislead the reader right away. That's one thing, but don't hold yourself to like the title at the beginning. Go over at the end once you feel like the poem is fully, once it's at a point where you're like, oh, I think it's done, then maybe think like, well, is this the right title, or is there something else that the title can do on behalf of the rest of the poem that I have that feels complete?
Thank you. That's great advice. And I'm hoping, although, it's okay if it changes, but one of the new poems you read, the Obad that was trying to be an Ars Poetica, with that's amazing. Keep that. I argue to keep it.
I kind of like, yeah, like a form that wants to be a different form. I mean, and like I've been also writing about or like concerned with and fascinated by the idea of capacity, or the capaciousness of a poem, because I think it's very weird that I'm a poet. Sometimes I think it's very weird, and so I want to know, now that I am a poet and that is part of my life, like, what can a poem do for me? What can it do? You know, what can I do as a poet? Like, what capacities do I have? What and where are my limits? And so I know Bod trying to be an Ars Poetica is like pushing up against that limit, and I'm interested in that a lot. I think again that has to do with identity again.
Well, I think a good follow-up question to that is one from Anna, and then there was a really good one from Jonathan too that we're going to get to right after this, and maybe we can kind of close up with that. So Anna said, you make yourself so vulnerable in your poems. How do you get into that space?
That takes it happens over revision. I'll say two things. One is that I usually start a poem with an image, and then I wonder what I or my speaker is doing in the poem. Like, why are they there, and why do they need to stop the reader to say this poem or to have this poem be shown to them. Another thing I'll say is that, like, I'm usually not the only one that's like being or having to be vulnerable in the poem. Usually it's like my homies are going through something that I sort of like bring up or put to the forefront of the page. And so I don't ever want to throw anyone under the bus unless I'm throwing myself under the bus as well. Like, I don't want my homies to read those poems and feel like I called them out unless I too am being called out. There was a poem, Learning to Box, where I basically am kind of like am the observer watching my friend teach his brothers to box, and like and like I'm there listening to how he talks about what his dad had done at this grocery store, and I had gotten the poem to a point where I thought it was finished, and I realized that like my speaker is not an active observer. He's just kind of like there watching it, and I felt like it was almost like, I don't know, voyeuristic or just like sort of like mean spirited in a way. And so I had to have a line where I say like, you know, I could have said something, but I didn't, just so that I am also making sure that there are stakes for me as well as my other characters.
Well, that's great advice too. And especially, you know, if you said now you're thinking about writing sort of creative nonfiction and what that looks like. And it can be a delicate line, right? You know, if you're writing about somebody or, you know, an event, and maybe part of, you know, making sure that you indict yourself as part of that.
Yeah, that shit is really scary because I I know where I have to go with creative, because in poetry you can be like, I don't know, it's a speaker. Like, I've said that multiple times over the course of this reading where I'm like, me or the speaker. But like, you know, there's speculation and imagination in creative nonfiction, but there are certain things you have to be willing to risk certain things. And it's not like, I don't think you have to like go back to things that like traumatized you, but I think I always go back to this idea of like, because I don't think writing is therapeutic, but I think writing helps me understand myself. And I use understand, or I say understand, and I mean it in the etymological sense, which is to say, to understand is to stand in the midst of. So I want to understand myself. I want to stand in the midst of myself. And that is really tough. But I think that is also necessary for writing.
Absolutely right. I think there's sort of that, you know, even when writing creative nonfiction, poetry, anything, there's that commitment to veracity that you have to make in a certain sense. That can be really difficult, like you said, to kind of sit in, right? But I think the most relatable writing kind of comes from maybe that place.
Yeah, it's vulnerable, and then someone else sees themselves there. And I mean, that's the writing that I've been drawn to, is I see myself there, and I'm really thankful that someone said it, and that I was like, oh yes, like that is very true. And I don't know why I wasn't feeling that or thinking that, or I was hiding from that. Yeah.
So let's see, there's one more question in the chat that I wanted to get to, because this is something else that we, you know, we're interested in and had discussed. So Jonathan wanted to know a little bit more about your experience working with incarcerated people.
Yeah. So I've been teaching with the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop for, I think, the last 4 or 5 years. The pandemic has really thrown that off, but we're hoping to get back into the facilities in maybe by fall. I love, those are like really great students because they, first of all, they have, I think there's a certain record of good behavior that the students I get in class have to have before they can get in class. And second, when they're in class, they're an interesting mix of like very willing to try to write because no one as far as like the officers care about what they have to say, because the officers are only concerned about like safety protocols and all that. And so they see the inmates as numbers, and so that's just how that side of it goes. And when they're in my class, they're students, they're writers, and so my students are always, there's a mix of really eager to have their work read and talked about and discussed and talk about each other's writing. And then there's also the other side of it, which is they are very much intimidated by creative writing, especially poetry. Poetry seems like something that's way out of their reach because a lot of their knowledge of poetry is like the very, the classic stuff that I think is great to read, but also very hard to relate to because the way people spoke back then isn't the way we speak now. And so my students I often start the semester off with them having to, have conversations and talk through and navigate the idea that the words that they have and the words that they use are the words of poetry. Because that's how I write too. Like I want my work accessible or welcoming. And so you can have very complex, complicated feelings with without having to have a huge vocabulary. And I think they think otherwise at first. And I used to think that too, because I have like really old notepads of my very first poems where I was trying to rhyme at the end of every line. And I was trying to make sure there was like a multi-syllabic word on every line. And I thought I had to present it a certain way before I got really comfortable with the way I talk. And I try to like get them to that point. So that's probably the most rewarding teaching. Some of the most rewarding teaching I do is with those incarcerated students. And I really hope to get back there soon.
Well, thank you for that work that you do. I mean, I think it's so essential because one of the great things about poetry is that it reminds us kind of what it is, the meaning of being human. And in that sense, again, we were talking earlier about how like we can see ourselves as humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in a place where you're looked at as a number, now you're given a space to feel like a human being again.
Yeah.
Well, we so appreciate your time, Michael. And maybe if we could just end with some advice for aspiring poets or writers. What might you say?
Oh,
no pressure.
I know. I think two things I'll say. One is that like if you're feeling that like writer's block coming on, or if you're feeling frustrated with the piece, I would suggest to stop, take a break from it, and do something that where you don't have to really think about things, like go for a walk. I wash dishes or I go for a walk if I can. The other thing I would say is like really lean into something that's like weird and explore, like just kind of be willing to go in that direction. Those always give me like really weird and interesting results that might not end up being the final product, but it will take me in that direction where I think I need to go in a way that might surprise me because I go in a weird direction, and surprise is always where you kind of want to head with poems.
Well, thank you for that wonderful advice, and a little bit of inspiration to take us off into the rest of our evenings. So let's take a moment and thank Michael. A real round of applause is also welcome if you would like to.
Thank you.
Again, we so appreciate your time, your gracious answers. I know we're keeping you up late. And good. So we're thankful that you were able to join us this evening. And thank you to everybody as well. Thank you for your great questions. I was really enjoying this conversation. So again, what a great way to celebrate National Poetry Month. And we have an event coming up in a couple weeks. I'm going to throw into the chat a link if you want to learn more about that event, writer Harold Jaffe, and or just more about the series. So we would appreciate y'all. And thanks again, Michael. It was wonderful to meet you. And we look forward to that YA novel in verse.
Yeah, I'm like sweating. All right.
We
Thank
put
you
it out
all.
to the universe. It's gonna
I
happen.
know. Yeah, working on it now. All right. Have a good night, y'all. Thank
All
you very
right.
much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Take
Bye.
care.